There's a conversation happening inside you right now. Maybe you barely notice it because it's been there for so long. Like the hum of a refrigerator in a quiet room, your mind gets used to the sound. You wake up and the conversation begins. You look at your life and something inside you comments on it. You think about money, relationships, your body, your future, and a voice answers. Sometimes it encourages you. Sometimes it predicts disaster before breakfast. Sometimes it repeats an argument from 3 years ago, like the other person is still standing in the room. And because nobody else can hear any of this, it seems harmless, private, just thoughts. But what if those inner conversations are doing far more than describing your life? What if, little by little, they're teaching you what kind of life to expect? That's where the idea of talking to your inner self, what ancient spiritual language might call talking with God, becomes much deeper than positive thinking. Forget the image of shouting requests towards some distant figure in the sky for a moment. Look closer. Scripture says the word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. Another ancient teaching joins mind and speech together, almost as one creative power. So maybe prayer begins much closer than most people realize. Maybe the temple is consciousness itself, and the conversation happening in its quietest room is the one you've been having with yourself all along. Not the words you say when people are listening, the words underneath those words. And here's where things get uncomfortable, because most people aren't consciously choosing that conversation. They're inheriting it from yesterday. A disappointment happens once, and the mind begins saying, nothing ever works out. Someone rejects you, and suddenly the inner voice whispers, people always leave. Money gets tight, and the conversation quietly becomes, there's never enough. Before long, a temporary experience becomes an identity. An identity becomes an expectation. An expectation becomes a filter through which everything is interpreted. You're no longer simply experiencing life. You're walking along mental tracks laid down by repetition. And if those tracks never change, you can travel for years while somehow arriving at the same emotional station again and again. Think about how easily a conversation can continue long after the actual moment has ended. Someone says something irritating at noon, and by midnight you've had 12 imaginary arguments with them. In every version, they say exactly what you expect them to say. You defend yourself perfectly, maybe you even win, yet your body doesn't know the argument is imaginary. Your shoulders tighten, your jaw clenches, your mood changes. Soon you walk into tomorrow already prepared for another fight. Then the person speaks. You hear their words through that expectation. You respond from the mood you've rehearsed. And suddenly the relationship gives you more evidence for the story already playing inside. Strange, isn't it? The inner conversation begins looking less like commentary and more like rehearsal. Imagine two people walking into the same room. One quietly assumes, nobody here really respects me. The other carries a different inner atmosphere. There's room for me here. Neither belief is painted on the walls. Nobody announces which assumption is correct. Yet each person notices different expressions, interprets pauses differently, chooses different words, carries a different posture, and invites different responses. One becomes guarded, the other becomes open. Over time, life appears to confirm both of them, not because every outside event is magically controlled like puppets on strings, but because consciousness has enormous influence over what you notice, what you expect, what you permit, what you attempt, and how you relate to the world standing in front of you. Ancient teachers understood something subtle about speech. Words don't merely leave your mouth. Words organize attention. Say internally, something is wrong, often enough, and the mind becomes a detective searching every room for evidence. Say, nothing changes for me, and opportunities may walk past wearing ordinary clothes while you fail to recognize them. Your inner speech becomes a kind of mental compass, maybe not an infallible command over every event in existence, but a powerful orientation toward a certain reality. You move toward what you repeatedly accept as true. And because inner speech carries feeling, the effect goes deeper than a sentence. You aren't merely repeating words, you're inhabiting a state. So, before trying to change anything, listen. Really listen. Not with judgment, not with panic. Become curious about the conversation underneath your day. What do you say internally when someone doesn't answer your message? What do you say after seeing your bank balance? What do you whisper to yourself when you look in the mirror? What conversation begins when you imagine your future? Those moments reveal the old script, and once the script becomes visible, something important happens. You're no longer trapped inside it without knowing. Awareness creates a little space between you and the voice. Inside that space, choice becomes possible, and choice is where the conversation with your higher self truly begins. Most inner prayers are secretly arguments with absence. Listen carefully and you'll hear it. Why hasn't it happened yet? When will somebody finally love me? Why can't things ever work out? The words may sound like requests, but emotionally they're declarations. They keep announcing the same condition: not yet, not here, not mine. It's like standing at the door of a house you wish to enter while repeating, "I'm outside, I'm outside, I'm outside," and wondering why your imagination never experiences being home. Here's where prayer begins to turn in a completely different direction. Instead of speaking endlessly about what's missing, begin inwardly speaking from the state in which the desire has already found its place in you. Suppose you want peace in a relationship. Most people mentally rehearse the problem. They picture the next disagreement. They hear the other person using the same painful tone. They imagine themselves frustrated before anything has happened. A different inner conversation would begin from resolution. Maybe you hear the person saying, "I'm glad we talked. Things feel different between us now." Maybe you feel yourself answering, "Yeah, there's finally some understanding here." Nothing dramatic, no theatrical affirmations, just a short inner exchange that belongs naturally to the reality you wish to inhabit. You aren't trying to force another human being like a character in a play. You're changing the state from which you meet the relationship. Here's the key. The inner conversation should sound like something you'd actually say if the situation were already resolved. If you desired financial stability, you probably wouldn't walk around chanting, "I possess infinite abundance," every 7 seconds. Maybe your natural inner speech would be much quieter. "Okay, everything's covered. There's enough. I can relax." If you desired good health, perhaps the fulfilled conversation sounds like a friend saying, "You look great," and you casually answer, "Yeah, I've been feeling really good lately." Fulfilled desire often sounds surprisingly ordinary. That's why it can feel real. The mind doesn't need fireworks, it needs a new premise. And once you understand the premise, you stop treating imagination as an escape from reality. You begin using it as a place of inner instruction. The old self says, "Show me evidence, and then I'll believe." The new self begins experimenting with the reverse. Let a new assumption live within first, and see what follows. Ancient language describes this as calling what is unseen as though it were seen. In practical terms, you stop waiting for circumstances to give you permission to feel differently. You generate the conversation that belongs to the person you intend to become. Slowly, the inner room changes, and when the room changes, you walk into the world differently. So, how do you practice this without turning your mind into a 24-hour affirmation machine? Start with one area, not your entire life. Pick something carrying emotional weight. A relationship, your work, your confidence, your health, your sense of direction. Then notice the sentence most often attached to it. Maybe it's, "Nothing I do is enough." Maybe, "They don't appreciate me." Maybe, "I always mess things up." Don't fight the sentence. Fighting often gives it more energy. Hear it for what it is, an old conversation, a mental habit, a piece of yesterday asking to become tomorrow. Once you recognize it, you can choose not to feed it. Next, define the state you would rather occupy. not merely the object you want, the state. How would you feel if the matter was settled? Relief, security, respect, love, freedom. Then create a tiny imaginary scene that implies completion. Keep it simple. Someone congratulates you. A loved one tells you everything worked out. You look at a message and smile. You hear a doctor say the words you hope to hear. You sit in your home at night, feeling the quiet certainty that things are okay. Enter the scene as a participant, not as someone watching a movie of another version of yourself. Hear through your own ears. See through your own eyes. Feel the moment from the inside. Then add the most important element, natural inner speech. What would you be saying if the desired state were already real? Let those words arise. Don't strain. Maybe the whole conversation is only 2 sentences. Hear another voice if it helps. Hear the warmth in it. Answer naturally. Let your body respond. A small breath of relief, a softened face, a feeling of, finally. Stay there for a moment. Not because duration earns you some cosmic reward, but because feeling gives the inner conversation depth. You're teaching consciousness a new emotional language. And afterward, carry the conversation gently. You don't have to police every thought like a security guard patrolling a hallway. You'll slip. Old arguments will come back. Fear will interrupt. Some mornings, the old identity will be sitting at the edge of the bed before your feet touch the floor. Fine. Notice it, then return. Again and again. Transformation doesn't require never hearing the old voice. It requires no longer treating that voice as the final authority. Each return is like turning a wheel a few degrees. At first, the vehicle still appears to be moving in the old direction. Then gradually, the road begins to change. Here's something nobody should hide from you. Your former inner conversation may feel more convincing than the new one. Of course it does. You've rehearsed it longer. A path walked every day becomes easier to follow than one cut through fresh grass. So when you begin speaking inwardly from confidence, love, success, forgiveness, or peace, part of you may immediately answer, "Come on, you know that isn't true." Don't be shocked. You're hearing momentum. This old pattern can be thought of as the old man, the former conversation tied to the former identity. Putting on the new man means changing not only what you want, but what you repeatedly agree to be inside yourself. Imagine someone who has spent years thinking, "People overlook me." Then one day they decide to imagine being valued. At first, the new state feels almost dishonest. Compliments are dismissed. Opportunities feel suspicious. Kindness gets explained away. Why? Because the old conversation has become familiar enough to feel like truth. Familiarity and truth aren't always the same thing. Sometimes familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar possibility. So the work isn't to scream over the old voice. The work is to remain faithful to a different inner relationship with yourself until the new conversation becomes home. Ancient wisdom says, a seed produces according to its kind. Corn doesn't become wheat halfway through the season. In the same way, the state repeatedly planted in consciousness tends to produce thoughts, moods, choices, and reactions of the same nature. Plant resentment all day, and you'll notice reasons to resent. Plant defeat, and every obstacle becomes prophecy. But plant the inner speech of someone who expects wisdom, dignity, love, and meaningful progress, and your mind begins organizing around a different center. New choices become easier to see. New responses become available. You stop watering the emotional garden you've spent years saying you wanted to leave. Here the spiritual meaning becomes especially powerful. If the Word of God is understood as the living word within consciousness, then talking to God is no longer limited to moments when your hands are folded and your eyes are closed. The conversation is happening in traffic, in the shower, during the pause before you answer someone, at 2 a.m, when fear tries to predict the next 10 years. Every one of those moments becomes sacred territory. Everyone becomes an opportunity to ask, which voice am I agreeing with right now? The voice of the old condition, or the voice of the state I've chosen to enter? Something changes when inner speech stops being only about getting things. At first, people come to ideas like these because they want a result: more money, a relationship, recognition, healing, some visible change. Nothing wrong with that. Desire gets your attention. But sooner or later, a deeper possibility appears. If inner conversation affects how you meet life, then you can use imagination not only for yourself, but lovingly toward others. Instead of replaying someone's failures in your mind, you can begin seeing them restored. Instead of secretly expecting your friend to remain stuck, hear them telling you they found their way through. Instead of mentally reducing someone to the worst thing they've done, hold an inner conversation with the version of them that has become wiser. There's something beautiful about this, because nobody needs to know you did it. No performance, no spiritual badge. You simply refuse to use your private world as a courtroom where everyone is endlessly sentenced. Someone struggling comes to mind, and instead of rehearsing their struggle, you imagine hearing strength in their voice. You congratulate them. You hear their relief. Maybe the outer situation changes in ways you never expected. Maybe your relationship with them changes first. Either way, consciousness is no longer feeding the same old image. Love has entered the conversation. And perhaps that's where the word God begins to make sense in a more intimate way. Not as ego pretending to be omnipotent, not as a claim that every event in the universe bends instantly to personal wishes. Something quieter, something more demanding. The divine conversation becomes the movement within you that calls life toward what is noble before the evidence is complete. It speaks toward healing instead of humiliation, possibility instead of condemnation, creation instead of endless reaction. It asks you to become responsible for the atmosphere you carry in the one place nobody else can enter unless you invite them, your inner world. So watch what happens when you begin living from there. External reality may not rearrange itself according to your preferred calendar. People still have choices. Life still contains uncertainty. Yet you won't be the same person meeting it. Your attention changes. Your emotional posture changes. Your speech changes. Your actions change. And often, circumstances begin reflecting those changes in ways that once seemed unlikely. You start understanding why inner conversation matters so much. Words spoken silently don't vanish. They become mood. Mood becomes expectation. Expectation shapes behavior. Behavior shapes relationship. Relationship shapes direction. And direction, given enough time, becomes a life.